Have you ever wondered what could be hiding behind a beautiful smile and rich appearance? Everything seemed calm on the street until they appeared on the horizon. The heir to a large corporation, used to getting everything and everyone he wanted. When this young man, full of self-importance, began to pester the girl, he expected that she, like everyone else, would succumb to his influence. But her refusal awakened in him anger and contempt. His voice became harsher and his gaze more icy as he realized that his status and money had no effect on her. And then he began to act rudely, not even realizing whose daughter she was. The tension seems to be building by the second. What do you think happened next? Write your name and city in the comments. We're so curious to know where you're watching us from. Your attention and support help us to create such stories and develop the channel. You are the most valuable thing we have, and together with you we become stronger. Thank you for being with us. The sunny day flooded the park with bright light, turning it into a living painting. The leaves rustled in the breeze, and the passers-by strolled peacefully, absorbed in their thoughts. He stood out among the crowd, a young man with his head held high, dressed in luxurious brands that screamed of his wealth. He was the kind of man who, before he entered the room, already knew that all eyes would be on him. He was used to it. All his life he had been certain of one thing: his money, his status, his power, and this day was to be no exception. His gaze stopped on a girl sitting on a bench, a little pensive, not paying attention to the people passing by. She was dressed simply but tasteful, and there was an inner wholeness to her image, something beyond the material world, something that hooked him immediately. He grinned, squinting slightly, as if this was the game he was so used to conquer, get his own. He didn't know her, but he'd already decided that today she would be his trophy, another medal in an endless list of victories. With that smug decision, he strode toward her, a confident gait that suggested a habit of suppression and domination. His heart beat faster, not from excitement, but from anticipation. The only thought in his head was, this girl is already mine. She just doesn't know it yet. But the girl raised her head, looked at him with a fleeting glance that was completely neutral, and sank back into her thoughts as if it didn't exist. It was a surprise to him, but it only added to the excitement. He was approaching her, certain that one look would be enough to make her speechless. It was always like that. One glance, a slight smile, and the world was at his feet, as if he held the invisible threads that controlled the fate of those around him. But her calmness was confusing, as if his presence were as insignificant to her as a random passerby in a crowd. Subscribe to Deeple Pro to edit this document. Visit www.deeple.com /Pro for more information. He sat her down on the bench beside her, leaning slightly so that she could see both his expensive watch and the ring with the family crest. He expected her eyes to linger on those symbols of wealth and status, but she only looked at him calmly, showing neither curiosity nor excitement. There was nothing in her gaze that said she was at all interested in his presence. He felt irritation, sharp, unexpected, rolling over him in a wave. At first he had tried to hide it behind a smile, but inside him he had a feeling that this was not just a misunderstanding, but a challenge. Who did she think she was, to reject him so calmly, without even a shadow of respect? "Hello, beautiful," he said, raising an eyebrow, as if challenging her. "It wasn't every day I met someone so peculiar." She nodded at him, but her answer was cold and brief. It made him even angrier. He could feel the friendliness slowly fading from his smile, replaced by an underlying threat. "Do you realize who you're talking to?" he added, a note of disdain in his voice. "I can offer you something you can't even dream of. Everything you want. Isn't that what people like you dream of?" He emphasized the last words, as if drawing a line between himself and her, emphasizing that she was from a very different world, the world of those who had to obey, a world of people he was used to thinking of as beneath him. He knew his words would hurt, perhaps humiliate, and that was fine with him. He expected her to show at least a shadow of submission, but she only looked at him with a slight smile that had something defiant in it. Her silence became unbearable to him. It wasn't just a game, it was an insult. She was refusing to comply, and he couldn't stand it. Irritation grew, turning to anger, fueled by the feeling of humiliation. A voice filled with contempt sounded in his head. People like her should know their place. People like her have no right to behave so arrogantly in front of me. Unconsciously, he clenched his fists, and there was something sinister in his gaze. He felt a rush of aggression, a desire to make her submit, to prove that she was a nobody next to him, rich, powerful, belonging to the elite. Don't make yourself important, he said, his contempt evident. You know that people from your background are here to serve. You're lucky I paid attention to you at all. But the girl, calmly glancing at him, uttered only one phrase. You shouldn't talk to me like that. You don't know who my father is. There was no threat or fear in her words, just a firm warning. His face contorted with barely restrained rage, and he felt the heat of shame and humiliation shoot through him. Who was she to utter such words? Her calmness, confidence, and lack of fear of him fueled his anger, pushing him to a brink beyond which only contempt and hatred remained. How could someone of her level dare to think they could speak to a man of his status as an equal? Your father? He grinned, and there was open mockery in his grin. You think that makes a difference? Do you think your father is one step closer to standing with the likes of me? You commoners are all the same, always trying to appear better than you are. He looked at her, seeing in her eyes not fear, as he'd expected, but cold calm. It hurt him even more, as if every look she gave him said, "You're wrong." His contempt only grew stronger. It seemed to him that she, a representative of those he had been accustomed to, considering inferior since childhood, considered herself his equal. He wasn't going to tolerate that. I know you need the money, don't I? He continued, his voice quieter, more dangerous, like a predator before it leaps. You're all like that, just waiting for a chance to grab what doesn't belong to you. Money, power. You can't get it all without people like me. He took a step closer, and toward her so their faces were level. He wanted her to feel his strength, his superiority, for her smite to melt away, replaced by fear and submission. Your father is just a word. You should be more humble. While I'm still willing to put up with you trying to look proud, you're just like the rest of them. Your role is to serve. Do you understand? His words were full of contempt and racist undertones, as if he saw her and her father as insignificant figures created only to serve his world, a world of wealth and power. In his eyes, she was one of those who should swoon before his gaze and gratefully accept any attention from him. But the girl did not waver. She stood in front of him, not showing an ounce of fear. Ed looked straight into his eyes. Her calmness tore him apart, heightening his sense of his own insignificance. He stepped closer, breaking the invisible space between them where there was still room for respect and dignity. Now she was right in front of him, and there was still an icy challenge in her eyes that only fueled his desire to break her will, to make her feel the weight of his superiority. His hand trembled, but he lifted it nonetheless, touching her shoulder without permission. There was something almost painfully pleasurable in this violation, in the violation of her freedom, her independence. Listen to me, he hissed through clenched teeth, his voice barely audible but already hard and strong, as if he wanted to crush her not only physically but mentally. I'm not used to people like you being so arrogant. You should be grateful that I paid attention to you at all. Her face remained impassive, but there was contempt in the gaze directed at his hand. It was a mute rebuke that pierced him again, awakening his rage and hatred. It seemed to him that her every silent reaction challenged his power, his importance, his existence. How could you be so proud, so independent, when you had no money, no position? It was beyond his comprehension. His mind buzzed with thoughts that sizzled his common sense. He wanted to humiliate her, to make her feel insignificant around him, and in that rage, his voice became more and more mocking and sarcastic. You think you can just act like that around me? He continued, squeezing her shoulder a little harder, emphasizing his strength. With your position, with your background, you're bound to respect the likes of me. Are you and your family so stupid as to think otherwise? His words, saturated with echoes of racism and contempt, penetrated her ears but did not touch her. She remained as unperturbed as a rock. Without even flinching, she met his gaze, and in her eyes there was none of the fear, pain, or humiliation he longed to see. On the contrary, there was a confidence in her gaze that only made him more furious. At that moment he realized that it was not enough for him to subdue her. He had to destroy that strength in her, destroy her dignity, erase her self-confidence. Her hand came up slowly, and with icy calmness she removed his hand from her shoulder, as if she were swatting away a pesky fly. The simple gesture burned him like a slap. There was no trace of fear or embarrassment in her movement, only cold determination and a mysterious, silent certainty that stood between them like an impenetrable wall. "I already told you," she said quietly but firmly, her voice breaking the tense silence with a firmness he couldn't understand. "You shouldn't talk to me like that. Your money and your last name mean nothing to me." Her words hit him like a thunderclap. How dare she speak to him like that? Her refusal wasn't just insolent, it was humiliating, as if she didn't see anything in him that would make her bow her head. The words, "Your name means nothing to me," hammered through his mind, blow after blow, until there was nothing left of his confidence but raging rage in the sense that she was trampling everything he was. "Doesn't mean anything," he hissed, feeling the anger mixed with surprise rush out. "You dare to reject me, you, who has no status, no position, no idea who I am?" There was a note of contempt and racism in his voice, born of his belief that people from the common classes should see him as something elevated, almost unattainable. He looked at her, feeling anger and a desire to make her feel her own insignificance, her unworthiness to stand next to him. He felt as if his own existence were threatened if she could reject him without repercussions. Everything he believed in would crumble. It seemed to him that this was the decisive moment, the moment to prove at all costs that men like her had no right to reject men like him. "Maybe you should think again before you say that." His voice was low and hard, trying to suppress that confidence in her, to make her realize her mistake. "You have no idea how easy it is for me to break your life, to turn it into nothing. You think anyone's gonna believe you? Do you think anyone will take your side when I, the man with money, influence, and power, decide that you made a mistake?" But her gaze remained unchanged, fearless, as if she knew something beyond his comprehension. He felt his ego, his pride cracking at the seams, crumbling away like the shabby fabric he'd worn with his head held high for so long. Never before had anyone looked at him with such cold certainty, denying him the respect he thought he was entitled to. It was unacceptable. It undermined everything that made up his inner world, a world where power, money, and privilege opened any door to him and made people bow down. Her gaze, unwavering, awakened in him a sense of acute humiliation and the impotent rage that had been building up and boiling inside him. It was as if that look questioned his whole being, and he could not bear it. It seemed to him that every silent look she gave him, every word she spoke, was an invisible blow designed to overthrow his greatness. His voice shook, and he struggled to hide the aggression that overcame him. He did his best to suppress the feeling, but she managed to knock the ground out from under him with her mere presence. He couldn't believe that in the middle of an ordinary day, a stranger with no status, no position, and no what he considered a right to respect could dare to treat him like this. "You don't seem to understand where you belong," he growled, trying to catch her gaze, to suppress her will, but her eyes remained the same calm, cold eyes that didn't reflect an ounce of fear. "Do you think you're special, that your father or your family can protect you from me?" He stepped closer, his face tense as he fought the irresistible urge to force her to recognize her place. Every glance she gave him was painful, every bit of her confidence evoking in him memories of how he used to humiliate others. But now it was different. She wasn't just rejecting him, she was challenging everything he was. "You're a nobody," he continued, his voice barely restrained, laced with resentment and contempt, joined by a clear racial dislike. "All you can be is a shadow in my path. Men like you are meant to serve. Your refusal means nothing. You won't even realize the horror that will befall you if you turn against me." He said it defiantly, hoping that the words would shatter her confidence, that they would cause at least a shadow of fear. But she just stood there without flinching, her calm impenetrable. In that moment he realized that her strength was not in her looks, her words, or even her origins. She drew it from something far deeper than he could have imagined, and the realization was eating him up from the inside out. He took another step, so close that there was not an inch of personal space between them. His face was tense, every muscle as if on edge with repressed rage. She was staring straight at him, not averting her gaze, and that calmness was literally exploding in his mind. He saw in her eyes not just confidence, but contempt for what he represented, for his world, his values. "You and your father," he growled, putting all his hatred into the words. "Men like you should always stay where you are. Servants, executors, subordinates. Do you really think any of you can step out of the shadows?" His voice trembled with arrogance, with confidence in his rightness. From childhood, he had been accustomed to believing that there was some order in which his class was at the top and people like her were always below, not entitled to equal treatment. More than once he had seen his family speak of people outside their circle as those who were born to serve, to help, and to be useful, but never be in their social role. This view had been reinforced in him over the years, as if it were an immutable truth, and the fact that anyone challenged it offended him to the core. "I could break your life with one phone call," he continued, reveling in his own power, which seemed to grow more elusive with every glance she gave him. "One command from me, and both you and your father would lose everything you have. Do you think you can look down on me so easily, as if you're entitled to pride? You are the dust beneath our feet, and you don't get to dictate the rules." His words were drenched in racism, filled with contempt and hatred that he himself considered natural. He had no idea that the world where those words meant power was a thing of the past. All he wanted at the moment was to see the fear glimmer in her eyes, to see her finally realize her mistake and submit to his will. He wanted to wipe away the cold calmness from her face, the defiance that he thought humiliated him and challenged everything he stood for. But the girl, listening to his tirade, did not flinch or avert her eyes. A barely perceptible green flashed in her gaze, as if his hateful and threatening words meant nothing to her. "Are you so sure of your right to humiliate people?" she said quietly, her voice like a blow to his ego. "But one day you realize that true power isn't threats or money. True power is respect, which you'll never get." The words hung in the air like a cold autumn wind, tearing his confidence apart. His arrogance, so carefully built on contempt for commoners, cracked under her gaze, under her words. Her words echoed in his head like a gong, striking a hole in the confidence he'd spent a lifetime building. She had told him the truth he refused to hear. His power, his superiority was but an illusion, fashioned out of hereditary privilege, not real respect or strength. The thought lodged in his throat like a bitter pill, poisoning his mind. But he couldn't let himself give up so easily, couldn't let any words corrode his hold on her. His whole being rebelled against the thought, against the fact that this girl, whom he felt did not belong with him, had dared to defy him. A new wave of aggression erupted in him, a dark and deep-seated hatred for those he had considered inferior since childhood. He gritted his teeth and grabbed her arm, pulling her closer to him. There was something almost insane in his eyes, fear mixed with rage, the realization of his own powerlessness over something that couldn't be suppressed with words or threats. He thought that if he could force his will on her, break her confidence physically, he could feel in control again. "You dare speak to me as if you have a right to your opinion," he growled, his voice low and cold as steel. "You and your whole family should worship men like me. I can ruin your whole life if I want to, and there's nothing you can do about it." She didn't resist, but her gaze remained steadfast, calm, as if to say, "You're just a pathetic, frightened boy hiding behind a mask of wealth." It infuriated him even more, as if she saw through him, saw not the confident air he tried to appear to be, but a frightened man who lacked real power. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he hissed, trying to quell her fear. "This whole town belongs to people like me. We have you and everyone like you under our control, and you'll never be able to change that." Her lips curved into a slight grin that made him shiver, as if her calmness wasn't just courage, but something much deeper, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "You think control is all you've got?" Her voice was quiet, almost caressing. but there was steel in it that seemed to cut right through him. Your fear is the only thing you live by. You fear losing your illusion of power, and you hate anyone who shows you how vulnerable you are. You don't realize that sooner or later all your privilege and money won't be able to protect you from your own weakness. The words hit him like a slap. She spoke to him like a child, as if all his money and power meant nothing. As he squeezed her hand, expecting to see fear in her eyes at last, his anger grew, with it the tension, but something in her gaze confused him. There wasn't the fear in her eyes that he so wanted to evoke, though there was a hint of something in the depths, perhaps a shadow of worry, a moment of doubt, but it wasn't what he'd expected. Instead of terror, instead of trying to break free or lower her gaze, her face remained hard, as if she knew something he didn't. His heart was pounding furiously, his fingers trembling with tension as he squeezed her hand, preventing her from freeing herself. Her stamina, her defiant calm, seemed to condemn him and make him want to subdue her even more, to break her will, to make her realize her place. It was as if every second of her silent resistance was tearing him apart from the inside, leaving only an abyss of shame and hatred. Do you really think you're going to get away with this? His voice was dangerously quiet, and there was an aggression in it that didn't make her flinch. If you think you can't just ignore me and look at me with that disdain, you're sorely mistaken. She lowered her eyes slightly to his hand that held her wrist tightly and said quietly, "You shouldn't go on. I'm warning you. You don't realize where this is going." There was a subtle threat in her words, but not in the way he'd expected. She didn't say it like someone defending herself out of fear, but like someone who knew she had more than words behind her. That hidden confidence was tearing him apart. Who was she to look at him as if he was beneath her, as if his money, influence, status, all of it had no value? His anger grew, and with it the darkness in his heart, fueling his desire to put her in her place at any cost. But inwardly, deep down, he was troubled by doubts. She was too calm, too sure, as if she knew something important that he didn't understand. "You can't intimidate me," he blurted out, his voice filled with a venom and racism he didn't even try to hide. "You and your powerful friends are nothing to me. I own this town, and if I have to, I will destroy your family, your reputation, everything you hold dear." Her answer was short, but there was a hardness in it that burned him cold. "You think too much of yourself." His fingers trembled with rage. The only thing going through his mind was that she must break, must feel her mistake. It seemed to him that his whole existence depended on shattering her confidence, on making her admit that she was wrong, that men like her couldn't talk to men like him as equals. He was just about to answer her even more sarcastically when suddenly there was laughter behind him. His friends, who were standing nearby, had noticed the scene and moved closer, clearly fueling his confidence and arrogance. They were just like him, children of rich and powerful families, used to thinking that the world belonged to them by birthright. Their laughter, mocking and cruel, injected a new feeling into his soul, support, affirmation that he was right. He saw the approval in their eyes, and it elevated him again in his own eyes. "What do we have here?" One of his friends smirked, glancing at the girl. "Our prince has run into resistance." Was he refused? The words were drenched in venom, ironic mockery supporting his feeling that everything that was happening was nothing more than a minor incident in which the girl had only further overshadowed herself with insolence. A left, judging her, supporting him in the belief that she was obliged to bow out while she still had a chance. "She must not realize who she's turning down," added the other, not concealing his disdain. "You have to train people like her to know who you can and can't be with. They're always like that, aren't they? First they stand up proudly, and then when they realize they're against the authorities, they back down." His friends circled them like predators surrounding prey, and their mocking comments spurred him on even more, filling him with a renewed sense of superiority. He cast a glance at her, full of contempt and malice, as if she were just a small obstacle in his way, a mistake to be corrected. "Did you hear that?" he said, no longer hiding his mockery and racist contempt. "Why, friends are right. People like you should remember their place. You exist to serve and obey, and if that's not enough, we can make sure you don't forget it." His words supported by the approving laughter of his friends, sounded like a final verdict. It seemed that her fate was sealed, that his influence and the support of his friends was an immovable wall from which she had no escape. He had power in his hands, and he was ready to use it to wipe out any resistance. But her face remained calm. It was like oil poured on a fire, increasing his rage. He couldn't understand how she, surrounded by the threat, backed by their wealth and power, could remain so steadfast. "Do you still think you're stronger than us?" he asked with a sneer, his voice full of confidence that they had won. But her gaze was cold again, fearless, with a slight shadow of disappointment, as if she saw before her not scared people, but simply angry children whose behavior was nothing more than a display of empty bravado. She endured their scornful glances and gloating sneers, as if their words were no more noise to her than the wind. But something in her eyes changed. The calm, fearless look was replaced by another, sharp and piercing, as if she saw something pathetic and despicable before her. Her composure cracked, and a look of pent-up anger flashed across her face, as if their words had finally broken through some inner boundary, shattered the peace she had so carefully preserved. Her eyes sparkled, and now they held an icy determination he'd never seen before. The change made him recoil inwardly, though outwardly he maintained a mask of confidence. It seemed to him that for a moment he felt a real fear, subtle and barely perceptible, like the herald of a thunderstorm. He forced himself to suppress the feeling, banishing any weakness as his friends, satisfied with their role as spectators, cackled again, fueling his excitement and desire to finally break her spirit. "Oh, I think she's pissed off," one of them said mockingly, taking a step closer and seeming to strengthen the ring around her. "See the look in her eyes. I think we've hurt her feelings." Her lips curved into a grin, barely perceptible but filled with contempt. It was as if she were challenging them all, letting them know that they were wrong to underestimate her. Her silence, her gaze, became more and more impenetrable, like a wall that could not be broken down by words, breaths, or even the influence he was accustomed to using. He felt his arrogance colliding with something stronger than his confidence, her uncompromising steadfastness. "Do you think your power is in money and status?" she said at last, and her voice sounded like a lightning strike, cold and merciless. "But the truth is that you are just pathetic shadows hiding behind the names of your fathers. You're all afraid of real responsibility, afraid to face the consequences. My family understands what strength is. Real strength is the ability to take responsibility for your actions. And you'll never have?" "Yeah." The words hit his pride harder than he was willing to admit. They sounded like an accusation of what he had always tried to hide. All his life he had enjoyed privileges and power not earned through his own efforts, but inherited from his family. She, the person he considered beneath him, did not see him as great and strong, but as weak, hiding behind someone else's accomplishments. One of his friends tried to throw a derisive phrase back, but there was such power in her gaze that he was half silent, not knowing what to say. She wasn't afraid of them, and it was beginning to cut through each of their minds like a poisonous thorn ripping through confidence. He stood in front of her, feeling his confidence crack again. Her words, cold and sharp as eyes, penetrated the very depths of his mind, undermining what he thought was his unquestioned right to power. It seemed to him that his whole world was beginning to crack at the seams, that her gaze was revealing his own vulnerability to him. But he couldn't afford to show it, not in front of her, not in front of his friends, who were now encircling them in a ring, waiting to continue, not realizing that something had already changed in the air. She squinted slightly, her face serious, as if she had finally made a decision, and then, without averting her eyes, she said something that instantly extinguished the mocking smiles on his friends' faces. "You have no idea who you're messing with. If you did, you wouldn't have made a move on me, but now I'm afraid it's too late." Her words were soft, but there was a threat in them, not veiled, not hidden behind emotion, but clear and calm, as if she were saying something she took for granted. He felt a wave of rage sweep over him at this insolence. How dare this girl, a person he considered beneath him, dare to threaten him, that heir to a family that controlled half the city, him, the man who could destroy her and her family with a single phone call. You dare threaten me? He said through gritted teeth, his voice filled with disgust and hatred. Do you really think you stand a chance against me? I can break you and your family in seconds. But she stood still, her face impenetrable, and that cold, hard gaze, like an invisible force, pressed on him, making him feel something new, the feeling he'd been suppressing for so long. Fear. She didn't try to justify herself, didn't back down. Her eyes betrayed no fear, only hardness and absolute certainty, as if her words were a reality he couldn't yet grasp. You have no idea how profoundly wrong you are, she said, her voice calm, as if she really pitied him for his ignorance. You're sure that money gives you all the power? You can rule the world with it, but you've forgotten one thing. There are those who will never let you ruin the lives of others. You're just a little boy used to hiding behind a name and money. His friends frowned. The laughter died down. They looked at each other, not understanding how she could be so sure, or what power was behind her words. There was worry in their eyes, as if they, too, felt their world, their usual confidence in their invulnerability, began to crumble. He felt his heart quicken its rhythm, the feeling that her words were true awakened an uneasiness in him that he tried to shake off, but could not. It seemed to him that this girl, standing in front of him, was not just a threat, but as if fate itself had come to remind him that there were things beyond money and influence. But, not to show his doubts, he tried to regain control by raising his voice, hoping his contrived confidence would break her. Let's see how long your self-confidence lasts when I get my way, he growled, feeling his words begin to sound uncertain, as if the threat had lost all its meaning. She only nodded silently, casting a look full of disappointment as if it was the last obstacle she intended to overcome, and said, if you're determined to follow through, you won't like what lies ahead. Her last words, spoken with frightening certainty, seemed to turn his world upside down, but he quickly forced himself to chuckle, hoping that this stubborn expression of mockery would give him back control of the situation. Did she really think anyone in her circle, her father, her family, were capable of threatening him? His friends gathered around him, noticing his chuckle, broke into loud laughter, picking up his mood. She, with her calm in her background, was ridiculous in her calmness and confidence. Do you really think your words mean anything to me? He threw, pretending her threat was just a ridiculous joke. You know, you act like you can fight back, like you mean something. You're really nothing. The familiar arrogance was back in his voice, and he hoped it would give him back his confidence. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he had the feeling that he was overdoing it, that arrogance and aggression no longer worked as well as they used to. Her calmness, her silence, the silence with which he met his every threat, every insult, only made it worse, fueled something strange and unfamiliar in him, an uneasiness. But he couldn't let it feel that way, not in front of her and not in front of his friends. Instead, he decided to increase his pressure, as if he hoped to convince himself of his own power over her. But if you like to think you're important, he continued with a chuckle, trying to insinuate his superiority. Who am I to stop you? Maybe it's a tradition in your family to dream big. That's a lovely fantasy. But as you realize, here in the real world we decide everything. Everything belongs to us. My father and his friends run this town. He emphasized the words run this city, reminding her that all important decisions that affected people like her were made by people of his status. He wanted her pride to evaporate, to make her realize that her hopes for inner strength meant nothing before his money and power. But she just didn't say anything. The slight chuckle in her gaze flickered again, and it unnerved him. Her silence felt like a slap, like a silent condemnation that frightened him. She looked at him as if he were insignificant, as if his power and money were empty words. Her eyes radiated something more than he was willing to perceive: fierceness and utter contempt. Clenching his fists, he took another step, his voice trailing off into a croak. Well, since you don't understand the words, he growled, moving so close to her that there wasn't an inch between them. I can show you what happens to those who defy me and my family. You won't be able to continue your stupid game when you find out that I'm not really kidding. His friends cheered him up, throwing in mocking phrases, assuring him that everything that was happening was just a moment in which he would emerge victorious again. But inside he sensed that this was not the case. Her calm gaze, her steadfastness, made him uneasy, but he didn't want to admit it to himself. She looked at him, her gaze even more focused and serious. There seemed to be a deep determination in her eyes that said, "You don't know what really awaits you." Right at that moment, something changed. Heavy footsteps sounded in the distance, sure and measured, as if the force's approach were inevitable. He didn't immediately notice them, absorbed in his anger and his desire to suppress it, but he felt the air around him grow tense, as if the space itself were warning him of something imminent. He and his friends turned and saw a tall, powerful man striding confidently toward them. There was something frightening in his calm stride, something subtly familiar and yet threatening. Dressed with exquisite austerity, he moved without haste, but as if no man in the city could stop him or dare to stand in his way. His friends fell silent, and one of them coughed awkwardly, and suddenly the feeling of victory and superiority vanished, giving way to anxiety. The face of the girl in front of him changed subtly. A slight, subtle smile appeared on her lips, as if she knew this moment was coming. Something flashed in her eyes that made his heart clench, not fear, not submission, but the full realization of what he was about to realize. When the man approached, everyone frowned as if hypnotized, unable to take a step. His face, stern and impassive, remained unruffled, but there was a cold fire in his eyes. The look of a man who knew how to handle power, but who, unlike them, understood the true cost of that influence. That gaze swept over each of them, as if assessing them and piercing them through at the same time. The young man, gathering the remnants of his self-confidence, took a step forward, trying to maintain a proud posture, although inside he felt a strange coldness and fear rising from within, paralyzing him. He struggled to get the phrase out, full of defiance and irritation. "And who are you to interface?" he asked, his voice trembling, but he tried to hide it behind a mask of arrogance. "Do you think you can make us leave?" The man stopped, and his eyes narrowed, as if something ancient and indomitable had awakened in him. He looked at him carefully, and then, taking his time, turned his gaze to his daughter. At that moment, the young man felt something inside him break. There was a force in that gaze that was deeper and more powerful than he could have imagined. It seemed to sweep away everything from his soul, revealing the fear and vulnerability he had so carefully hidden. "I'm the one who always protects my family," the man said calmly, but his words sounded like thunder. "You're just a frightened child hiding behind wealth you don't deserve." The words came at him like a hammer, each phrase a blow to his pride, to his self-confidence. He could feel his friends backing away slowly, sensing that they were facing something beyond their world of privilege and money. His face paled, and finally he realized that he had been wrong to think that he could control everyone around him, that money and status entitled him to permissiveness. The man looked at him again, and this time his gaze was even harder. "Did you think your threats meant anything to us?" His voice sounded calm, but there was a contempt in it that the young man used to bestow on others. "Did you think you could humiliate my daughter with your money? You're a nobody, and this place doesn't belong to you." The words of the girl's father were a crushing blow to him. His friends, who only a moment ago had supported him with taunts and gloating comments, were now backing away slowly, their faces paling with each passing second. They sensed that the game had gone too far, that before them stood not just a man, but the embodiment of real power. Calm and ruthless, tension hung in the air, and each of them suddenly felt vulnerable, weak, as if their protective walls, money, status, connections had suddenly become empty words. The young man, unable to bear the man's gaze, which seemed to penetrate him through and through, looked back at his friends uncertainly, trying to find support in their faces, but they were already looking away. One of them even whispered, "Looks like it's his father. We'd better leave." Panic gripped them, and what seemed like a fun scene just a moment ago turned into a nightmare for real. They saw his eyes, normally mocking and confident, glaze over with fear, but the man kept his gaze on him, and that silence seemed colder than any shout or threat. The young man tried once more to squeeze out confidence, but his voice trembled. You can't scare me. You don't know who my father is, who my people are. We run this town, and you're all just. But the man stepped quietly closer, and his calm presence acted on the young man like the weight of heavy chains that tightened his pride and arrogance, turning them to ashes. You rule the city. The man's voice was so flat that it sounded like he was talking to a child showing off his toy castle. You don't even realize how far you've come. Did you think your surname gave you the power to humiliate others? That it covered your true face? He felt something inside him break, as if the backbone of his self-confidence were crumbling under the weight of those words. He suddenly felt his pride, his confidence, were but fragile illusions, crumbling under that cold, penetrating gaze. You're just a name on a piece of paper, the man continued, and there was something sobering in his voice, like a lightning strike. That name means nothing to me. You're used to living under it, but you don't even realize that it won't save you from responsibility, and the fact that you dare threaten my family shows how weak you are. The man's words hit him, as if breaking down his inner walls one by one, leaving him alone with himself, with his fear, which could no longer be hidden behind arrogance and aggression. His hands trembled slightly, and he felt panic rising in his chest, as if his own world was crumbling right before his eyes. He looked back at his friends, but they were already starting to retreat, their faces pale and fear in their eyes. But the worst part was that even his racism, his belief that people like him would always be on top, meant nothing now. The man in front of him embodied everything he'd never understood: a quiet, uncompromising strength, beyond money or status. The young man felt his body go ice cold. Every glance this man threw in his direction burned like cold metal. He was used to the fear and respect that should come from others, used to seeing fear in the eyes of those lower in status. But now everything had changed. He was looking into the eyes of a man who didn't just despise him, but saw right through him, saw all his weakness, all his inner fears that he was so careful to hide. His pride resisted, gathering the remnants of his arrogance. He tried to say something that would restore his confidence, put him back on his pedestal. He realized that there was more at stake than just his ego. It was a matter of his status, of his superiority over people like her, people he had always considered beneath him. I think you're forgetting who you are. His voice shook, and he felt his words sound weak, almost pitiful. My family, we have influence here. We have power. With one phone call, I can. The man took another step toward him, and the young man suddenly felt his voice fading, his confidence fading as the icy collar clutched his throat. The man's gaze was implacable, and there was no end of fear in it, only cold, impassive judgment. Influence, power, a man repeated, and his words were spoken with such sobering simplicity that the young man felt them awaken in him not just fear, but shame. Do you think your power is something real? You're so afraid of losing it that you don't see the most important thing. You're nothing, just an empty shell covered by money. Those words penetrated deep into his consciousness, tearing him apart. Never in his life had he felt so vulnerable, so defenseless to someone he considered beneath him, to the family he was trying to humiliate. A chilling fear seemed to envelop his body, as if all his privileges were crumbling away, leaving him alone with the truth he'd been running from for so long. His friends, already pale with fear, began to retreat, and he realized that this time no one would defend him. None of them dared to face this man, dared to stand up for him as they had done before. He realized that at this moment his money and status no longer meant anything, that they were all just children playing a power game they didn't really understand. The man took another step, and now the young man was so close to him that he could feel his breath, cold and determined. He saw contempt in his eyes, but worse, pity, as if he were not a man but a frightened child who had made a mess of things and didn't know how to get out of it. One thing they didn't teach you was respect, the man said, his voice calm, but with a power the young man couldn't resist. And now you're paying for it. The young man felt his whole world crumble like a house of cards. The man's every word was like a blow to his pride, to his sense of superiority, which he used to wear like protective armor. But now that armor was cracking, breaking, exposing the fear and weakness he had been hiding even from himself. For the first time in his life, he was face to face with a man he could neither humiliate nor intimidate. And this man was looking at him as if he could see his insignificance. The man standing before him was her father, this simple girl whom he had threatened not so long ago, intending to break her will, to intimidate her into submission. He remembered every phrase he had used, full of venom and contempt, and now those words came back to him like echoes, echoing in his father's cold eyes. The man stood confident and calm, showing no anger or rage, and that only added to the fear that gripped his heart. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, his hands beginning to tremble, but he tried desperately to maintain a semblance of calm. He wanted to say something, to regain some sense of control, but the words were stuck in his throat, unable to get out. It was worse than any threat, worse than any scream. This silence was his nightmare, his weakness. "You and your friends," the man finally spoke, his voice low but steely. "You think you are superior to others. You think that your origin, your money, your connections give you the right to humiliate, to break people. But do you know what real power is?" He wanted to object, to throw something insulting, but he felt that if he dared, the man would crush him. The man looked at him as calmly as if he were nothing more than an unpleasant nuisance. "Real power," the girl's father continued, "is when you can but don't use it, when you don't let your power blind you. You're used to power without having earned it. You're used to respect without understanding it. All you have is your name, but without it, you're nothing." The words came crashing down on him like a landslide, shattering everything he thought about himself. He felt a wave of humiliation wash over his face, the bitterness of shame engulfing him, tearing him apart. Before him stood a man who was the embodiment of power, and he was just a boy hiding behind privileges he had been born into, not earned. "And you know what the worst part is?" The man leaned in a little closer, his voice quieter but only more dangerous. "You are so absorbed in your imaginary power that you don't even realize how weak you are. You think you're superior to others because of their color, their background, their position. But power, is not about that. Strength is respect, honor, and the ability to take responsibility for your actions. And you don't have that." Each word, full of contempt, was like a slap in the face. He felt his body go limp, man's gaze ravaging him from the inside. For the first time in his life, he felt small, worthless, as if his existence was meaningless. He stared at the man, feeling panic rising inside him, and with it a sense of acute, almost unbearable shame. "You are used to thinking yourself superior to others," the man continued, his voice implacable, "but life will punish you for that. One day you will be left in this world, without protection, without a name to cover your weakness. And then, when you face the real power, you will realize who you really are." The man's every word seemed to strike at the young man's heart, tearing his confidence and the remnants of his arrogance to shreds. He stood there, stunned, unable to look away from this man who not only held him captive to his words, but destroyed everything he had built his pride on. It seemed to him that he had never been spoken to like this before, with such calm fury, such contempt, which was like ice water on his heated, pride-filled heart. His friends, who had recently cheered him and supported him with taunts, stood a little apart, silent, their faces pale and anxious. They, like him, were accustomed to privilege, to a life in which their actions always found justification. They had never seen their wealth, their status questioned by anyone, but now they felt as vulnerable as if they were suddenly stripped of all their power, as if their insignificance were revealed to them. The young man, gathering the remnants of his courage, finally squeezed out a trembling, "Bryce, you don't understand. My father, he's not gonna let this go. I'll tell him that you threatened me, that you tried to embarrass me and my family. You're not gonna get away with this." But even to him, the words sounded pathetic and empty. His voice sounded uncertain, trembling with fear and resentment, as if he were desperately trying to find some foothold to regain control of the situation. He felt like he was losing not just in this conversation, but in the underlying realization that his familiar world was crumbling. He felt like it was about to get angry, but the anger didn't come. Instead, there was only a sense of helplessness and an awareness of his weakness. The man shook his head, and then a faint expression of disappointment flickered across his face, as if he saw not an enemy, but a lost boy who had become entangled in his illusions of power. "Do you still think money will solve everything?" he asked, and his words came like a blow, like a chilling reminder of reality. "You're so used to hiding behind your father's name that you don't even realize that you'll have to take responsibility for your actions and life. Your father can't save you from the consequences of your words and actions. No one can. The words pierced him like needles, robbing him of his last strength to resist. He felt his skin break out in a cold sweat, his face flushed with a shame he couldn't hide from. All he wanted was to disappear, to hide from this man's gaze. But he couldn't move from his seat, or get a word out. His usual trump cards, money, status, power crumbled to dust, as if he realized for the first time that it was all just an illusion. You talk about your father as if he were your salvation, the man continued, and there was no aggression in his voice, only cold hardness. But you have no idea what responsibility is. You think you can humiliate and trample on people who can defend themselves and never be held accountable. This is your tragedy, young man, yours and everyone else who hides behind money like you. The young man felt his throat go dry. Every word this man said burned, made it impossible for him to turn away from the truth. He had been running away from all his life. He no longer felt privileged and powerful, only lonely and worthless. It seemed to him that his whole world was collapsing, and now he was alone with this truth. He saw his friends moving farther and farther away, unwilling to intervene, afraid of the consequences, and that only made him more desperate. The feeling grew inside him that he was truly alone now, and no one would come to his aid. The man stood before him as if he were the embodiment of everything he feared but did not want to admit. This was a man who needed neither money nor status to inspire respect, whose power and influence came not from a family name but from inner dignity and confidence. The young man felt the remnants of his confidence fading away, leaving him defenseless, small, vulnerable in front of this man. The man took a deep breath, as if trying to calm himself before uttering the words that were to finally destroy the young man. You must understand. His voice was quiet, but there was a strength in it that made him tense. That this time I'll let you go. But if ever again you dare to threaten my family, to humiliate people just because you think you are above them, you will face consequences you cannot even dream of. You won't be able to hide behind money. You won't be able to hide behind your father's name. You feel real responsibility. The words flew through the air, burning every fiber of his being. The young man felt a lump of panic rising in his chest, as if someone had squeezed his heart with an icy hand. He tried to hold back, to retain a little bit of pride, but everything inside him screamed with fear and humiliation. A man used to ruling people like puppets, found himself helpless, standing before someone he considered inferior, but who had shown him what real power meant. The man leaned slightly toward him, and there was a look of steel in his gaze. You spend your whole life looking down on people based on their skin color, their status, their position. You feed your conceit that others are supposedly inferior to you. But the truth is that you're just a little person, dependent on everything you've been given, not on what you've earned. And you realize that today? The young man felt his pride. His anger gradually turned into a sharp, agonizing shame. He realized that to this man he was no threat, no interest, only contempt. Everything he had relied on his racial prejudice. His supposed superiority now seemed pathetic and insignificant to him. He realized that his whole life had been a lie built on illusions. If you ever decide to prove your strength, the man said, stepping back and giving the young man some space to feel the weight of his defeat. Prove it not with money, but with deeds. And remember, when you humiliate others, you only humiliate yourself. This is a law that you will never understand if you hide behind family names and hatred. He nodded silently, feeling his face flush with shame. He realized that nothing he said would change what was happening. All his usual words, his threats, his promises, had become meaningless, empty. For the first time in his life, he realized what it meant to truly lose control, to be the one being judged and despised. The young man stood there, lost and broken, watching as the man turned and took his daughter's hand. After one last glance, they slowly headed away, leaving him in silence and all alone. His friends, those who had just been his support and cheered his arrogant threats and scorn, were long gone, dissolved into the crowd, leaving him alone. He felt how lonely and insignificant he really was, without the support and reassurances family had always provided him. Standing in that empty space, he felt a wave of remorse and despair wash over him. For the first time in his life, he looked at himself through the eyes of others, saw how pathetic his world was, built on contempt for others, money, status, and deep-seated prejudices. Every time he looked at people as beneath himself, he was only fooling himself. His belief in his superiority based on skin color, family status, and wealth now seemed to him not just a lie, but a weakness that had robbed him of a lifelong understanding of something important. As he stood there, unable to move, the phrases of the girl's father came back to him. His hard words that seemed to pierce his soul and leave painful marks. Everything he had always thought he was entitled to was now only a symbol of his own cowardice. His inability to see the world beyond his privileged life. The money he was so used to waving around meant nothing when confronted with the true honor he did not possess. His mind flashed back to moments in his life when he had allowed himself to humiliate others just because they looked different or belonged to a different social class. Many times had he insulted and threatened without even thinking of the consequences. His inner prejudice, which he had always perceived as a strength, now turned into a weakness, an inability to see the human being in the other, an inability to respect. Realized that the racism on which he had built his superiority was just a shield to cover his fears and his own insecurities. This bitter truth was tearing him from the inside like an icy lump, stiffening everything. Inside, he had nowhere else to hide, not behind money, not behind his family name, not behind the support of his friends, who had also abandoned him at the first danger. Now, he was alone with his weakness, and every moment, every glance of the man and the girl remained in his memory as a reminder of who he really was. His old world no longer existed. Now he had a hard truth to live with, and that truth was that he was no better than anyone else. All his former beliefs about his own exceptionalism were false, and the hatred with which he looked at people who were different from him was just a reflection of his inner emptiness. With a heavy heart and a devastated soul, he finally took the first step away, realizing that, from now on, he would have to reevaluate his life and recognize that true strength is the ability to see the human in everyone he meets on his path. Dear viewers, what do you think of today's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments, especially if you have had similar experiences or have experienced bias and injustice. I really need to hear your opinions and stories. Each of you is an incredibly valuable part of our community, and we are truly grateful to have you with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like to support us and help spread important stories that make you think. We wish you all a great day, and remember, respect and understanding is the real power. Thank you for being with us.